What is it that fascinates us so much about abandoned spaces? Is it because they're like windows through time, allowing us to catch a glimpse of the past? Is it because they're somehow sad and beautiful at the same time, for reasons we find hard to describe? We don't know the answer to that, but we do know there's something special about all the places you're about to see in this video. We don't think that the people who opened Yangma Land theme park in Seoul, South Korea were attempting to challenge Disneyland when they opened the gates of their fun fair for the first time in the late 1980s. However, we do suspect that they hoped and expected that their creation would stay in business for more than 30 years. Sadly, that isn't how things worked out, and the abandoned theme park is now little more than a testimony to their failed dream. The park never moved on from the solidly 1980s-inspired aesthetic it was built with, and so by the turn of the century, it looked desperately dated. No changes or modernization work were carried out, and so by 2011, there were no longer enough people coming to the park to justify keeping it open. Superstitious local residents say that the park was shut because it was haunted, but the reality is that it was never haunted by anything other than debt and poor management. A local businessman bought the park about 5 years ago and now charges a small fee for ghost tours around the derelict rides, capped off by a small light display at the broken-down merry-go-round. There's something about this abandoned hotel in the Bali Highlands of Bachuri, Indonesia, that makes people feel a little uneasy about paying it a visit. We suspect it's probably down to its name. The locals refer to it as the Ghost Palace Hotel. From its appearance, you would guess that it's been abandoned since the 1950s. But the hotel and the surrounding resort attractions weren't even built until the 1990s, and they were abandoned just days before they were due to welcome their first guests. Back then, it was known as the Pai Bedugul Taman Rekrisi Hotel and Resort, and it was supposed to be at the top end of luxury accommodation within the region. Folklore says that all the staff who were supposed to work here turned up the day before it was due to open for their initiation and vanished overnight, with their ghosts now walking the corridors. A more likely explanation is that it was built by Tommy Suharto, who was known to engage in corrupt business practices and eventually went to prison for ordering the assassination of a judge in 2002. Our next abandoned place is also something of a ghost town, albeit one with a history that stretches back much further than the 20th century. It's Krakow in Matera, Italy, a medieval town high up on a stunning hillside. This was a busy, thriving town for more than 1,400 years and survived plagues, tribes of barbarians, and 2 world wars. But an enormous landslide finally put an end to human settlement here in 1991. While the people may have gone, the beautiful buildings they created over the centuries they lived here still remain. The town's castle, built in the year 1300, is especially noteworthy and contains a statue of the Virgin Mary that's said to have been found in a nearby lake in mysterious circumstances. The statue is the town's one remaining link to the outside world. Each year, a religious festival is held with the statue at its centerpiece, and thousands of people from the surrounding area come to fill Krakow with life once more. It's no longer possible to stay here overnight, but the views of the surrounding area from inside the town make any walk or hike worthwhile. We've already seen one holiday park in this video, but there's always time for another. This is Makassar Beach Pavilion in Cape Town, South Africa. It was once a water park, but you won't find any water there today. Instead, the entire site has been taken over by sand dunes. In fact, such is the density of the sand at Makassar that its former water slides have cracked open, unable to bear the weight. With the benefit of hindsight, it might have been better to clear the enormous sand dunes away before the park opened in 1991. It's part of a much wider national park called the Makassar Dune Reserve, the perimeters of which are marked with signs warning the public that the dunes have been known to move with little warning. In the case of Makassar Beach Pavilion, They moved in and made themselves at home. The theme park wasn't a hit and was closed by the end of the 1990s, meaning the rides, changing rooms, and other facilities have now been exposed to the elements for more than 20 years. Perhaps we ought to be surprised that it's not in a worse state than it is. We want to show you one more theme park before we move on. This time it's Taman Festival in Denpasar Timur, Bali, Indonesia. It was chosen for its jungle setting, but the jungle is eating it a piece at a time. Nobody really seems to know for sure why the theme park was abandoned, but most locals say its owners left the country after the terrorist attacks in Bali in 2002 and were never seen again. Others say that lightning struck the enormous laser machines that were supposed to project images into Bali's night sky, and the damage was too costly to repair. It's impossible to verify either story, but what we can tell you with certainty is that the park was abandoned after it was built, but before it opened. Someone spent a lot of time and money building this park and then gave up on it before it welcomed a single visitor. The facilities built here include an Olympic-sized swimming pool that nobody ever swam in, a cinema that never showed any movies, a wedding chapel that no ceremonies were ever held within, and restaurants that never served a single dish. What a colossal waste! Many of the abandoned wonders in Mexico were created by the Mayans or the Aztecs, but Las Pozas in the Chititla region is a little different. Rather than being the ruins of an ancient civilization, Las Pozas is all the work of one eccentric, reclusive English poet. Edward James visited this part of Mexico in the 1940s and decided to literally build his home here. When he bought Las Pozas in 1947, there was an old coffee plantation on the site, but James spent the next few years turning it into both a zoo and an exotic garden. 20 years later, a freakishly cold winter destroyed most of his plants. Rather than starting again by planting new ones, the poet made sculptures and statues, and then added bizarre architectural flourishes, including stairs that don't lead anywhere. Aside from his poetry, James wasn't big on communication. For that reason, nobody really knows why he did any of this. When he passed away in 1984, he took his secrets to the grave and left Las Pozas to become overgrown. Most of the people who live close to it don't even know it's there, but you do. You can probably guess who built Leningradskaya based on its name alone. It's an Antarctic research station, and it was built by the Soviet Union. In its abandoned state, it's become a little like a time capsule, albeit one that's impossible for the average person to visit. Leningradskaya sits atop a rocky outcrop in Antarctica's Victoria Land region, where it's been since it was built and opened in 1971. The Soviet Antarctic expedition saw it as a year-long research base that could both facilitate their studies and provide a temporary home. Instead, it remained open for 20 years. Nobody really knows what the Soviets studied here, although oceanology, magnetism, and meteorology are all likely topics of research for a base in such a location. It was only abandoned after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, after which there was no further funding available. The old huts have frozen over, preserving them just as they were with their supplies and equipment still intact. In theory, anyone could turn up here tomorrow, switch the power back on, and pick up where the last team of researchers left off more than 30 years ago. An abandoned research station is quite a thing to behold, but perhaps a whole abandoned town is even more impressive. We've seen one in the shape of Krakow in Italy, but our next location is larger and more modern. It's the ghost town of Sewell in Chile, a former mining town in the Andes known as the City of Stairs, on account of the fact that it has no roads. Sewell was built on top of a huge deposit of copper in 1905 and housed miners and their families until the deposit ran dry during the 1970s, leading to its abandonment. Under normal circumstances, a settlement left alone for this long would show signs of extreme deterioration. But the freezing conditions in this remote part of the world has preserved Sewell almost perfectly. It's over 7,000 feet above sea level, built on a slope so steep that wheeled vehicles have no chance of getting up or down it. To get around that problem, the town's planners built Escalera Central, an enormous staircase that runs from the railway station all the way to the uppermost reaches. There were plazas, a movie theater, and a social club. Alcohol was officially banned, but the miners always found a way of bringing it in from elsewhere. Haotuan on Shengshen Island in China might be the greenest town on the face of the planet. And we don't mean green as in environmentally friendly. By green, we mean virtually every flat surface in the entire abandoned town is covered in green foliage. Haotuan was once a thriving fishing village, but since its abandonment, nature has set about the task of reclaiming the land emphatically. The town is only 40 miles from Shanghai, but may as well belong to a totally different universe. 2,000 fishermen lived and worked here until the early 1990s, when the limitations of the small bay meant that there simply wasn't enough fish to provide everyone with a living anymore. The fishermen moved away, and the town fell silent. While the walls and rooftops of their former homes are thick with foliage, internally it's like time has frozen. Furniture, televisions, and personal items are still in exactly the same place they were left. Perhaps this is what would happen to every town and city eventually if humans disappeared one day. For such a dangerous and dirty place, there's something incredibly beautiful about this forgotten old slate mine in Wales. Work at the mine stopped during the 1960s, and locals started using it to dispose of unwanted junk. At some point, nobody knows when, people started pushing cars into the mine. Now there's a huge pile of cars standing 50 feet high, and the mine has gained the unsettling nickname the Cavern of Lost Souls. This strange car mine is in the town of Ceredigion and has become popular with urban explorers, even though local authorities forbid access to the site and have repeatedly issued warnings that it's dangerous and the tower of cars could fall down at any minute. Somehow, even though the rusty shells of the cars must be causing serious pollution issues as they disintegrate, the water has retained a bright blue color. Even so, we wouldn't recommend swimming in it. The majority of the cars appear to come from the 1970s, so it's possible that they were all dumped here at once, although nobody's ever been able to explain why such a thing should happen. Kelenfold Power Station in Budapest, Hungary looks futuristic. It almost looks like a design for the power stations of the future, but instead, it's the look of the power stations of the past. Kelenfold Power Station was one of the most advanced facilities of its kind in all of Europe when it opened in 1914. With its Art Deco architecture, it marked the first time that the aesthetics of a power station had been given as much consideration as its output. If you're wondering why it still looks mostly pristine, it's because it continued to supply Budapest with power until 2007. It would have been demolished by now, but parts of it are considered historically important and are therefore protected from demolition by Hungarian law. The buildings are now in private hands, and the owners occasionally open Kelenfold Power Station up to the public for tours and photo opportunities. None of the machinery has been moved out, and the original turbines from 1914 are still present. The glass ceiling in the central control room looks oddly out of place, like it was accidentally installed here, rather than at the ballroom it was supposed to end up in. Last up on this list is the naval port of Karosta, formerly the most important fortification in the Latvian coastal city of Liepāja. The surviving buildings are in such poor condition that they are literally crumbling into the sea piece by piece. During Latvia's Soviet era, this was a military town, and the naval port was a base for the Soviet Navy. Latvia regained its independence after the collapse of the USSR, and all the troops and military vessels that were stationed here went home to Russia. That was 30 years ago, and nobody set foot in some of these old buildings ever since. In truth, the buildings were already old by the time of their abandonment. Construction of the naval part was ordered as long ago as 1890 by the order of Alexander III. The work was finished by 1906, after which there was space for as many as 140 warships and 25 submarines. To protect the base, the entire city of Liepāja was encircled by a new wall. 3 years later, Alexander III's successor, Nicholas II, ordered the fortress to be closed because it was too expensive to maintain. It was only the outbreak of the First World War that brought it back to life, and now it's empty once more. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!